Hello, greetings from Lisbon, Portugal, to wherever you are listening. It is a great pleasure for Pedro Passos and myself, Duarte Araújo, to welcome you to the first episode of the webcast Ecological Dynamics of Skill. These first series are dedicated to sports, a domain we expect to visit very often. But we will also address other domains of skill, such as music and arts, mathematics and its teaching, scientific expertise, driving in roundabouts, and so on. We are committed to make these short episodes lively and contemporary, discussing theory, research, and applied practices, and whatever we think would fit into an ecological dynamics approach. By this, we simply mean a view of skill that goes beyond the organism and the performer, and beyond skill as a fixed property. So it is a great pleasure for us to initiate this webcast with the participation of Professor Keith Davids. Professor Keith Davids is a world-level scientist in the domains of motor learning, performance psychology, and sports sciences, who founded exactly the notion of ecological dynamics, as well as other notions like nonlinear pedagogy, constraints-led approaches, and so on. In fact, his paper from 1994, The Natural Physical Alternative to Cognitive Theories of Motor Behavior, an invitation for interdisciplinary research in sports science, challenged sports sciences to a biological and ecological grounding understanding of performance and cognition. And here, this paper showed that cognition is not something locked in the portion of anatomy inside of the head, but is expressed in every cell of our body, as embodied cognition fully means, as well as shared with the environment where performance happens as an emergent and self-organized phenomenon. This was almost 30 years ago, and although the difficulties for the field to understand such a huge transition, there are also extensive changes in sports sciences evolving until the present day. And this is exactly what we would like to hear from Keith Davids. What are the expressions of this change you can see nowadays, and what are the next challenges for the field? Thank you very much, Keith Davids, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, Duarte and Pedro. Thank you very much for both inviting me on this. Can I just start by saying I think it's an excellent idea for a podcast series. There are other ecological-oriented podcasts series around, but I think at the home of SEPA, I think SEPA is one of the hubs of ecological dynamics in the world, not just in Europe. And it's an absolute pleasure to be invited on here to talk about some of the points that you raised. And I think that some of the other speakers will talk about more contemporary things. But it was interesting to note your look back to the past, Duarte, when you talked about that paper published in 1994, conceptualized in 92. To be honest, it took a long time to publish that because in the Journal of Sports Sciences at the time, it reflected the cultural, educational, sports scientific trends at the time, and ecological psychology, dynamical systems theory wasn't really a part of the furniture, as you may say. So it was good to get that published, and from there, things gradually emerged. As you two guys know, because you've been part of the development of this program of research in your own way.
Very interesting, and indeed, this was quite a long time ago. And how do you see it lives in the sports practice nowadays? How do you see that the impact from those challenges that you raised in '94 now are living in our daily life, our daily practice of sports?
And as you both know, both your PhD programs and your ongoing research programs have contributed to the development of ecological dynamics, but ecological ideas, or adopting an ecological perspective on not just sport performance, but learning, development, behavior. And as you pointed out, Duarte, in your introduction, this isn't just related to sport context. It's related to anyone who's interested in expertise, in skill acquisition, in performance development learning in lots of different contexts. adopting an ecological perspective really does provide us with a meaningful difference in the way things were considered before. I guess for more contemporary listeners and viewers, before there was a tendency to lock up explanations for phenomena in learning, development, in sport context, to lock things up within the system, the body, as you called it, but also in one part of the body, which is above the neck or the head. Now, that clearly has a role to play, but it's the point of the 1994 paper was to say it's not the only locus of attention for psychologists, movement scientists, sports scientists, really. The proper scale of analysis after James Gibson's inspirational insights is that person environment scale of analysis. So from there, just explaining that theoretical rationale, the aim was then to provide some data, evidence to test these ideas and to support them with an empirical foundation. And now that's provided a really good solid foundation, I think, for the practical application of these ideas in many different sport contexts, whether it's team games, orientations, or individual sports, whether it's in high level sport performance or physical activity and recreation and exercise even. Adopting an ecological perspective is now a meaningful, makes a meaningful contribution to our understanding of human behavior in these contexts. So I wonder what you two guys think of that rationale.
Okay, Keith, I have one question for you. It's regarding, we know, as you said, that in the last decades, ecological dynamics provide us with a strong theoretical background for coaching principles. But I'm wondering, how much time do we need to see this theoretical background with a significant weight in the training methodologies? Because as we know, until now, the training methodologies are quite influenced by the strength and conditioning and by the physiological principles. Mm-hmm. And I want to know your opinion for how much time do we need to see the training methodologies clearly influenced by the learning theories as an ecological dynamics may provide? Yeah, can you give us a clue?
I don't know about giving a clue. I don't know whether I've got a clue, but I think that it's a really important question. But one of the things I've learned over the almost 3 decades of research, as your title captures, it's a very challenging thing to change behaviors, to change organizations, to change systems, to change the way that people are educated, developed, prepared for a professional role in a very important context, performance context like sport. It's a very challenging thing. Recently there was a paper written by Ross and colleagues talking about the strength of path dependence. Path dependence basically is an idea that originates in economics and in psychology that talks about the strong trace of some traditional ideas, which is difficult to shake. And so when you try to implement an alternative view, not necessarily even pushing away a traditional dominant paradigm or view of things, but actually just almost like elbowing your way into a position to correspond alongside, it's a challenging thing. And I'd imagine that to answer your question directly, I don't think I'll be around when ecological dynamics actually does infiltrate everything and become the dominant paradigm. I'm not sure it's the dominant paradigm at the moment, but it's certainly making waves. I think it's making a big contribution to understanding, and I'm gaining evidence from the last 10 years or so. I think there's been an acceleration of understanding, of application. And to be honest, without embarrassing you two and others at the time, from the early parts of the 2000s of this millennium, the acceleration can be traced to some of the research and applications that emerged from SEPA. And of course, along the way, other hubs of excellence when it comes to applied research to show how these ideas and to provide evidence about these ideas, how they may be applied, is gaining traction in places like Singapore, New Zealand, in Rouen, and the future speakers in your series will attest to that. So Pedro, yeah, it's an ongoing challenge to change the way that behaviours in such organisations are currently emerge, and it's one that I think it's gradually shifting according to my observational evidence anyway.
So by your words, can we say that now we are entering in the second round of ecological dynamics by, well, put the things on the floor, put the things on the field, and with that kind of applications that you are talking about? Can we say that, okay, now, until now, in the last 3 decades, we provide and we create research and we provide evidence regarding the main concepts of ecological dynamics. From this moment on, we are quite concerned, very concerned about how to implement these concepts on the field. Can we say that?
Yeah, there's different ways of looking at it. I actually think that this is a third phase, in the sense that the initial phase in the early 90s and throughout the 90s, and these aren't distinctive phases. So these aren't like sort of evolutionary scale or Paleolithic scales of analysis where you have one phase stops and starts, another one stops and starts. These are overlapping. I see these as overlapping. So the quest for anyone who wants to do more laboratory-based research from an ecological perspective, and I see papers emerging like that, I think that's a good thing still. It's still ongoing, but there's maybe more of a dominant sort of acceleration of application. So to go back to the 3 phases, in case any of the listeners are wondering about those phases. The first phase back in the 90s was theoretical, conceptual, to provide an alternative to the dominant paradigm at the time. And then it was clearly a case of having to set up experimental research programs to provide evidence and data to support these ideas, to refine them, to move them on, to enrich them, if you like. Because one of the things about ecological dynamics, as you both know, because you both contributed to this, is it's an emerging, it's an ever-evolving theoretical paradigm. It's dynamic, as in the clues in the title. And it's really about continually developing, enhancing as it gets, as there's interconnections made between different theoretical relational paradigms, but also as evidence emerges, taking us into different directions. This third phase now, you're absolutely right, Pedro, in my opinion, is there's confidence and maturity of the theoretical framework and people involved who really believe in taking an ecological view of things. There's confidence and maturity to apply the ideas in practice, in training environments, sometimes as alternatives, sometimes as supplements to existing training programs, but always being present there, always steeped in very, very powerful theory, modeling, and data.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I have one more question, but I will ask if Duarte have any kind of question now.
Go ahead, Pedro.
Okay, so if we are talking about putting the ecological dynamic on the field, my question is, the theoretical background that support these lead us to the field, focus more on teaching or more on learning? I want to know your opinion. Should we focus on teaching or should we focus on learning? What is the driving?
Very, very good perceptive question again. My own preference is to focus on learning, because I think that there are traditional emphases in teaching, coaching that are more related to instructing, that are more related to accumulating knowledge, what James Gibson called knowledge about the environment, which is information that's more abstract, more symbolically coded. That it's quite frankly, it's the information that's really relevant for a sports commentator. If there's somebody commentating on a performance, like a climbing performance or a surfing performance or a team game, competitive team game performance, a commentator comes with information, facts and knowledge about the history of the clubs, the environment, what's going on, etc. People who are actually engaged in the performance environment are dwelling in it, as my colleague Carl Woods and I have discussed in various papers. When you're dwelling in it, you need a different type of knowledge. If an opponent creates a problem for you, as you know yourself, being a rugby coach and a rugby player, an opponent creates a problem for you, you have to solve it not about quoting facts to the opponent or quoting abstract information that you've got stored, represented internally, but about engaging with the environment and trying to find knowledge that will help you to refine your performance, that will help you perceive relevant information, which regulates your behaviors, and perceive and utilize the affordances, the so-called opportunities or invitations for action. And that comes from learning. There is a role for teaching and coaching for sure, but it's a different role than is traditionally surmised. And that's more about guided discovery, guiding the learner to discover and self-regulate. And there's a lot of good papers coming out at the moment from young co-authors and colleagues like Carl Woods, as I mentioned, James Rudd, James Vaughan, Mark O'Sullivan, are all looking at good ways to enrich the learning process by guiding learners.
Okay, thank you. Very, very nice answer.
Yeah, very interesting. And in the same wavelengths, I think that this change in paradigm that you presented some years ago, the first thing is that it's good that it's not only one paradigm. There are many critical views about how practice is about, and I think that is always useful, even if I agree with some and I disagree with the others. But it's useful to have different perspectives. All of us become more sharp and more clear about what we are proposing. But also, I think the big challenge came because you were also saying that the things are not so simple as a cause and an effect, a dose and a response. And if you have some load in your body, then the response, the predictive behavior will be that one. So you challenge a little bit this paradigm of cause and effect, of those response that I think really guided coaching and training methods in sports sciences. And this challenge makes the things more difficult, but also more real. We can be based on an illusion and be very happy, but we are in an illusion that the things are so linear and so simple as if I apply this load, I will have that response. And so by saying this, I also means that by somehow challenging this more secure and more this view of controlling what you do as a coach, you are also creating some uncertainties for the coach and for what he has to do. And but I think at the same time you are also offering a rationale for that. So okay, this is simple, but it's not how the world works. But here you have an understanding of that. And the interesting thing that I found, and I would like to hear you on that, is that when the coaches realize that, they see, well, but I always worked in that way. My practice is much more into that way of understanding the things than to be strictly following the plan, because sometimes the athlete is not as I expected, the team is different than I expected, there is an injury, there is someone that is missing today for some reason. So I'm always adjusting to what I really have, not what I have on the plan. So do you see that this match is somehow possible in the field of practice when the understanding of what ecological dynamics means is offered to the coaches? How do you see that
that again, very good, very astute comments, of course, and I think that again, it touched on this notion. You really your comment, without getting into too much technical theoretical detail, it goes back to philosophical stance that are thousands of years old about categorizing knowledge. But it's not the only way that we understand the world. We understand the world in different ways. One is by associating symbols with meaning and categorizing things. So, for example, part of the role of a horticulturist or an ornithologist, a bird watcher, is to categorize information, to identify a bird or a flower, to label it, to catalog it into their records and files. But another part, another role, a very important role, is to experience what it's like to grow a flower or a plant in a particular context. And as any gardener will know, that gardens are microclimates and they change, and certain plants can't survive in some parts of even of a garden, never mind of a terrain or a country, and others flourish and are enriched by being moved or being taken care of in lots of different ways. And for me, I read a lot of insights from coaches, from teachers, good reflective practitioners, and they're constantly talking about adapting, adjusting, changing. And they know that, for example, that if you are going to play in or perform in a competitive environment that is going to challenge you, which is what all athletes want, what all coaches want. They don't want to keep succeeding and winning at the highest level week in, week out. It's impossible. Especially with today's emphasis on data collection, analyzing performance, you're always being scrutinized. So coaches know that good opponents and a good competitive venue, for example, a golf course or a mountainside or a bay in Portugal for surfing, Pedro, which again, I know that you like surfing a lot as well. You appreciate the challenge. You appreciate that there are different features, constraints of the task or the environment, which means that you have to constantly adapt. And one of the simple key messages, Duarte, of an ecological dynamics rationale, which I think a lot of coaches and teachers do resonate with, is that training, practice, preparation for competition and development over the timescale of learning needs to reflect that you are going to be constantly challenged, that you have to make sometimes very small, refined, fine-tuned changes, other times large adaptations, maybe unexpected adaptations that have to be rapid, without panic, under emotional control. And so, it's for me, it's something that you're right, coaches, teachers, trainers intuitively understand. But what ecological dynamics can do is provide them with a conceptual language which can help them to understand how to interpret what's going on and then how to actually then incorporate that in their learning designs.
Keith, may I ask you another question?
Sure, of course, Pedro, always. Yeah.
Okay, do you think that ecological dynamics may have more applications in some sports than in other sports? I perfectly understand that a rugby player needs to adapt to the teammates and to the opponents. A surfer needs to adapt to the conditions of the sea and the characteristics of the wave. But what about some kind of sports with physical constraints and task constraints much more tight, such as gymnastics or athletics, or even swimming, indoor swimming, not outdoor swimming? So do you think there is more applications, or it's more easier to applicate these concepts from ecological dynamics to some sports than to others, to another sport?
I think that the ideas apply to all sports. And I think what we're really talking about is the quality and nature of the adaptations, for sure. In the past, going back 3 decades in research, motor learning theorists and people who are interested in motor behavior talked about open skills and closed skills, open environments and closed environments. And essentially, that was based from an information processing approach. It was based on the amount of information that was present. So for example, more open environments had more information present, and closed environments had less information. I never did like that dualism, closed and versus open. It was often presented like that. Yeah. And I see it again, as with many things nowadays, I see much more as a continuum. And I talk about the stability of a task. So for me, the difference between someone engaged in an archery competition, someone who's weightlifting, someone who's a gymnast, a dance, or a figure skating coach, they're faced with challenges about the stability or instability in their environment, as are team coaches in rugby, in surfing, in climbing. Some environments, performance environments, are more dynamic, less stable, and others are a little bit more stable, but they're still dynamic. And when I've spoken to coaches and trainers who are a bit skeptical about this idea, they say, well, I'm not sure the ideas really apply to archery or gymnastics, as the example you gave. I've just said, okay, when you go to a performance venue, when you go to competition, what varies? What do you think, what may cause you some worries when you get there? And they go straight away, well, you know, the athlete comes along, they're feeling a little bit under the weather, they're a little bit more anxious, they're fatigued because they had a very hard session last week, you know, the last week training program. We're not used to this lighting, the swimming pool, the venue itself, the competition seems very enclosed, or it's very open, and they can tell you multitude of things that vary. So even the most so-called stable of environments are not completely stable. Otherwise, it'd be like performing in a vacuum. And so at the end of the day, you know, it's a good point. You don't have to make very drastic, major changes in some of these more stable environments. So it's about the coaches, teachers, trainers, athletes to understand the quality and the nature of the adaptations required. But 100% guaranteed, there are adaptations required because of this person-environment relationship.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Thank you.
Well, I will follow Pedro's question because now we have a very interesting example in Portugal. There was the European Championships of Gymnastics, and there was a Portuguese gymnastic called Filipa Martins who did a new skill, and the skill now has her name. It's called Martins. So I will not explain you exactly the details of what she did in the uneven bar, but the interesting thing is that she posted a video of the 9 months it took for her to achieve that skill, and all the attunement that was needed, all the calibration that was needed, lots of misses, lots of engagement, and how these things how she became progressively attuned. It was clearly an ongoing process. And interestingly, she presented also how the environment was changed to make her, to allow her to have an easier learning of that skill, like changing from a more soft floor, because she was falling very often in the beginning, to a more hard one, to more near the competition, and how all these changes were going on during 9 months. So I think it was really a good example of how this is not something strictly stored internally, but it's clearly a relation that was developed over these years. And I think the Portuguese coaches, Ferreirinha and also her coach, were sensitive enough to make all these accommodations on the environment to allow her to achieve this skill. Exactly exemplifying what you were saying, that we are always we are open systems, always. We are never a closed system.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good example of why it's important to take an ecological approach. An ecological perspective can give you that person-environment relationship. And so, as you know, Duarte, we've written papers on Bob Beeman's jump. We've discussed Dick Fosbury's move in the high jump. So, and of course there are moves in football named after key footballers like the Cruyff turn, etc., and Maradona's performance. And so, there are many examples of athletes being able to innovate and adapt to cause problems for opponents, whether indirectly they're competing, or directly competing or indirectly competing. But you're constantly challenging the opponents. So it's really about adapting and changing and having that mind view, an ecological mind view that is more process oriented. In other words, once you reach a certain level that might be recognized, you're a national level athlete or an international level athlete, it's important not to see yourself or the coach to see the athlete in a box and they've reached a certain level of expertise. It's a process. It's constantly ongoing and developing because the horizon, the landscape is constantly changing as well. And so having that mindset is a good way of approaching sport performance more generally, I think.
So Pedro, do you think there are some questions from?
There is a very nice question here from on the chat from Aris Tsangaridis. How can deceptive action in open skill interactive with individual sports such as racket or combat sports be studied or practiced from an ecological dynamics approach? Keith.
Yeah, there's many examples of that already, but essentially, if you're talking about if I understood it, deceptive movements of an individual, the idea is that the performer learns to self-regulate, and that obviously it's by playing against many different opponents in practice. It goes back to Duarte's point about a gymnast learning a move which is unique to herself. It took her 9 months, and gradually the task constraints in the environment were shaped in order to guide the learning process. Well, a learner learning to read the deceptive actions and not fall for it, from an opponent, or to perform deceptive actions themselves, they need lots of variability. They need that variability. They need to be able to be exposed in practice and in the lead up to competition to lots of individuals who have unique little moves themselves, whether they mean it or not. At my level, when I play tennis, I don't often mean it. And I might have some sort of foible or, sort of problematic way of performing a shot, which may confuse somebody. But once they understand, it's not deception, it's just a really sort of not very good performance of the skill. So it's about exposing individuals to that variability, about encouraging them to show the affordance of a particular stroke, as if they were playing a shot down the line, for example, and at the last second they change the way that they perform the stroke, so that the information that's picked up from the learner or from the opponent is actually different, and is not signaling too much in advance the intentions of the learner themselves when they're performing it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because also the one who is being deceived, he also learn how to use better information. And if at some time he is focused on some affordances, next time he will search for new information. And I would like to link this idea of the ecological approach is mainly based on interaction, and social interaction is a very rich point on it. But there is a question from Raúl Sanchez. He's a colleague from Madrid, and he asks a very interesting point. He says that the social dimensions of the constraints model seems to me not well developed. What do you think on this topic? How do you see that the social aspects of performance are embedded in the ecological dynamics?
Yeah, good point. We've been working as hard as we can, Raúl, in the last 3 decades, and but certainly, there are some people that are really looking at this in a lot of detail now. We could easily say that the organismic task constraints haven't been researched enough. I think that we need research on all the different categories of constraints and how they interact. But research from PhD students who are now established academics like Luis Uehara, Martin Rothwell at Sheffield Hallam University, Ben Strafford, Scott Russell, looking at football referees in Australia. There is a lot more research looking at performance and learning and the social, cultural, historical constraints that shape behaviors. In fact, there's a tendency to look at organizations now to see how an organization is located in specific communities or countries, and to see how they shape the way that the learning environments that people are exposed to. Even though you may have a universal learning theory like ecological dynamics, which explains learning, performance development, if you like, irrespective of socio-cultural constraints, it's important to acknowledge that socio-cultural historical constraints can shape the way, the practices of the form of life, as Martin Rothwell calls it, that influence the way that a person is coached, taught, and instructed. And it is an important area of study, which I think is definitely taking off, because more and more researchers are taking ethnographic approaches, action-based research studies, like the group at Porto in Portugal, Ana Ramos, Patricia Coutinho, and others. And so there's more qualitative research methodologies are becoming more and more important in contributing to our general understanding.
I think we have time for one more question from Pedro, or from the YouTube, as Pedro would select. And then we want to keep these discussions quite short and focused. And I think we are doing that quite well. But I think there is time for a new question from Pedro, and then we will close this very intensive and intense session. Pedro, please.
Sorry, guys. I'm just choosing one of the interesting questions that are, well, emerging on the YouTube. I like this one. Does the approach deliver a framework for intervention athletes can use to enhance performance besides practical training, like mental training, nutrition, etc.?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I from an ecological perspective, I would not like to favor one sub-system or dimension of the performer over the others. I'd like to see them all as integrated, because, for example, if you're hungry, then that can affect the way that you perceive the environment and the emotions that you feel. And so that, taking an ecological view commits you to looking at it, taking an integrated approach to the various, between the levels or the subsystems of a performer, and between the performer and the environment, and also within the levels as well. But for sure, I think for example, as a psychologist, as a nutritionist, they can all work together in what we've termed a department of methodology. My colleague Fabian Otte and Martin Rothwell as well, we've been pushing this idea that in many sports organizations, the plethora of scientists, applied scientists, and practitioners need to really work together and take an integrated view, rather than work in separate sections and pass people between the sections. Because I think an integrated view means you can take a more transdisciplinary approach, as James Vaughan calls it, where you put a problem or challenge or concept for an individual performer at the heart of it, and then different experts contribute to their understanding, which can then shape the individualized program that each athlete or team even can undertake. Very good question that was, by the way.
Okay, Duarte, if you allow me, there is one very, very interesting question from John Comer here in the chat. Kate, isn't it a question of infusing uncertainty rather than variability that you propose? Would you differentiate both? Very good, very good question.
That's probably one for the philosophers to decipher. But I think that if you take it down to a psychological view, the more information that's present, the more uncertainty that can cause, that can create for an individual, and more information is often predicated on more variability. So unless you are really pedantic as a conceptual philosopher, someone who's interested in the history of scientific ideas, it's difficult to untangle them. And typically, information, uncertainty, variability, and even knowledge. They're deeply intertwined. And so for me, does a coach or a teacher or a practitioner need to go to that level of philosophical analysis to differentiate between them? Probably not, but they certainly need to understand how to, if you like, create more certain environments, more uncertain environments, how that can contribute to knowledge of the environment for the individual athlete or the team, and how uncertainty and why uncertainty in practice and training may simulate the uncertainty of competition environment. But again, John Comer, very good question, but there are different dimensions to it. One that's philosophical, scientific, but another that's more practically oriented.
Very well. So I think there are many things to discuss still, and we will do it in different sessions. So it's good that Keith has so many interesting ideas to share with us. It's also very interesting to see the lots of questions that are placed in the chat, and the lots of people that are participating. We have more than 100 people watching these sessions, which is a pleasure to us to know that there is this interest. And we are also preparing for the next session next Monday at the same time exactly, and it will be Chris Button that will be with us. As you know, as those who are listening to us may know, there was a new book that was guided by him, The Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, with, of course, participation of Keith Davids. And it will also maybe a good moment to discuss some of the key ideas from that book. It will be a pleasure to have Chris Button next week at the same time here on this chat. For today, I deeply thank you, Keith Davids, for your very pleasant interview, for your very insightful messages, and for this challenging discussion that Pedro and I had the pleasure to have with you. Thank you also to all of our listeners, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you,
Keith. Thanks both of you. This is a great series. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.